Cell by Stephen King, a book I had a rather rocky ride with, a rocky relationship with throughout my reading of it. It was a very interesting experience where I found my initial start very inconsistent, questioning what was going on, what the purpose of it was, whether I cared or not to even continue, and actually even considered DNFing or did not finish being my first Stephen King book ever. But it had a rather quick turnaround, and once I really built some momentum with my reading, I ended up liking this book. I wouldn't say a tremendous amount, but I would say I liked it, which is considerable regarding how my experience reading it began. So today we are going to dig into Stephen King's 2006 publication, Cell, talk about some non-spoiler things, some spoiler elements, some connections to the Dark Tower universe. We're going to cover it all. So let's dig into it. So we have quite the interesting cover to start off with. We of course have classic little flip phone here. We see its shattered screen with seemingly some sort of liquid red substance both coming out of it, as well as this cup that we could probably find synonymous with blood. Am I right? And there is some sort of looming figure as well as a cityscape sort of reflected there. Doesn't seem like things are going very well is what I am saying when it comes to this cover, which is sort of where we start off with this novel. And before we dig into it, just want to mention this is one of the best author portraits on the back of this. Just good old Stevie peering through a door, looking very innocent, curious even. So Cell takes place at first in Boston. It's about this guy, Clayton Riddell, who is a comic book artist. He has struck a book deal and he is in Boston to do some work with this book, with his artwork, when all of a sudden this sort of apocalypse hits, and this is very much so an apocalyptic horror novel. Everyone around Clayton in the Boston city area that he is in, who has a cell phone, essentially goes insane on the spot. And there is not really any explanation. You are sort of thrown right into the chaos and mayhem of it. You are immediately seeing some very violent impacts of this craze that has overtaken everyone who has a cell phone. And you essentially learn that this pulse, which is labeled the pulse, was this cell phone signal that was sent over every cell phone network to all cell phone users that has essentially driven them all mad. They're sort of zombie-like killers who are attacking everyone in sight, including those who have been turned by this sort of pulse, as well as just like normal people who are labeled normies in this book. And essentially from there, like a lot of sort of Stephen King setups where some sort of big event happens and the protagonist is forced to team up with anybody who can be perceived as trustworthy or safe around them, teams up with them to figure out what's going on and face this sort of looming terror that is threatening to end the world. It's very much so in that category of Stephen King work, like Under the Dome, like It, which is probably the best example of that. Get a group of people together, something terrible is happening, there's some sort of evil present, they have to fight against it. Like Desperation, like The Regulators, like The Mist. You are very familiar with this almost like comfy Stephen King story structure, and that's sort of the structure we are given, which sort of led to some of the things that I found familiar and liked at times about it, but also some things that I didn't exactly love. So for the non-spoiler section, that's sort of the setup. Big cell phone pulse drives all cell phone users crazy. They start attacking everyone. This comic book artist, along with a middle-aged guy and a 15-year-old girl named Alice, sort of get together to travel north to figure out what is going on and to hopefully find Clayton's son and wife. So, to get into some spoiler sections, I'll talk about some of the things I liked a lot about this book, as well as some of the things I did not love. Let's start with some positives. I ended up sort of liking the progression of the system by which this whole pulse, this insane cell phone signal that went out, operated. The system seemed pretty logical, even though Stephen King is sort of notorious for being a pantser or a fly by the seat of his pants type of writer who doesn't really plot or outline anything, just kind of starts writing and sees where it goes. It felt like it had some order, which I think sometimes it is very evident that Stephen King's plots, the structures, the direction things seem to be going in, the system by which like magic might work in some books, or the system by which supernatural elements operate, has no sense or order to it, which can be kind of frustrating for the reader because everything can just feel like there's like a deus ex machina in it. There's just something very conveniently wrapping everything up because it is so sort of hastily thrown together that you're like, oh, that didn't feel like there was a lot to the way that resolved. But I feel like for the most part, that sort of system by which this apocalypse has been triggered makes sense. And for the time, again, reading this in 2023, it feels antiquated, kind of cringy the way people thought about like Y2K and how technology would like cause the apocalypse, and like it's this ticking time bomb. The way cell phones are talked about in this, just already 17 years after its publication, feel pretty old. But for that being the case, I think it's still readable, and I think it's still for the most part well done. Another thing that I liked is this sort of journey. I like the sort of travel log plot structure and sort of knowing where things are going, and knowing that Clayton, along with Thomas and Alice, have all sort of resolved to travel north to find Clayton's son and wife, and you're sort of worrying about their current state while you are very clearly going along on this journey north through Boston and Massachusetts and New Hampshire up towards Maine. It's just, I like that sort of like travel type of plot structure. And these characters I found at a minimum bearable. Plot focused book. This is not a character study. If you're into character driven books, I don't think this one is going to be perfect for you, especially in the way of Stephen King books. But if you like something that is very much so hinging on a specific plot point, like an apocalypse started by a rogue cell phone signal that's been sent out, then you'll probably enjoy this. The same way, again, you do with setups like Under the Dome and Desperation and the Regulators, where it is this big, terrible event. Whoever is left surviving bands up to fight, find out things, whatever it might be. And to sort of transition into the things that I liked to the things that I didn't exactly love. I both liked and didn't like the ending. It was satisfying for this reunion to occur between Clayton and his son, but the state in which it was left wasn't my absolute favorite. I'm not saying that I need every single book to be very cleanly tied off with a nice big shiny bow to be resolved perfectly and everybody lives happily ever after. But I feel like something that is so incredibly focused on plot and is a plot driven book, and that is what is carrying everything, it's a lot more satisfying to sort of have the plot, the driving point, the journey, the motivation for the whole journey that is taking place to be resolved in some way. Like, sure, Clayton finds his son, but you're sort of left wondering whether this recreation of this signal, this pulse that he plays for his son, who seems essentially like brain dead and without any memory of who Clayton is or was, without a few moments of like maybe recognition, it's just kind of left up in the air. And I really wanted to know whether or not he had his son truly back or not. Maybe that's a personal preference, but I like my plot-driven books to be resolved. If they are just sort of character-driven and there's not a lot of focus on plot, then I'm happy to sort of leave that open-ended, but this one felt like it needed to be resolved. And I both liked the reunion, but didn't love the way it ended. So to sort of get into some of my other dislikes related to a plot-driven book, it sort of leaves something to be desired in the way of character development. I feel like there were a lot of sort of main characters explored on this journey from Boston up to Maine, with all the phoners, with all the normies, with all the people that they come across, the people that come and go, whether they fall a victim to themselves or the circumstances of this apocalypse. It's just a lot of people introduced into a book that, again, is very plot driven, where there are a lot of them, but they're not really being developed all that well. So I found myself not really caring about any of the characters. I kind of cared about Clayton. I kind of cared about his journey, but I didn't exactly know anything about him other than the fact that he is an artist for comic books, that he is trying to sell a book, that he happens to be in Boston when all of this happens, that he's trying to get back to his wife and his kid. Other than that, I don't know a ton about Clayton here. And even though he is sort of the main character, the one we are supposed to care about the most, I found him in my mind just kind of on equal standing with all these sort of like secondary characters who are introduced throughout. And as a result, I kind of cared about them all the same amount, wanted to see how this whole cell phone apocalypse resolved, and whatever happened with the characters, whether Clayton reunited with his wife and his kid or not, wasn't by any fault of my own, I would think, really a top priority, because I didn't feel like it was a top priority in the book itself. So therefore, I didn't really care about what was happening to the people. I just kind of wanted to see the way that this apocalypse progressed. As morbid as that might sound, that's just kind of what happens when you make a plot-driven book. And if you introduce a bunch of characters that are 20,000 feet wide but only an inch deep, what else are you supposed to really do with it? That's sort of my main dislike. I can't pick a ton of other things out. I feel like there were just a bunch of small sort of symptoms of character development not being a major focus, but overall I still enjoyed this book a fair bit, and I appreciate it for getting better as it went on, for the sort of developing characteristics and qualities of these phoners, the way that this quote unquote virus sort of evolved in each one of the phoners and each one of those who were infected by this signal. I liked the way that developed and progressed. It didn't feel like this stagnant condition that was very easy to figure out. It was this living, breathing problem that these main characters had to deal with and solve along the way. And I liked the sort of intuition that was explored with a lot of them, the ingenuity of their solutions to the problems. They felt like competent characters, but at the same time, they just felt like people with not a ton of backstory that were just sort of solving the problems that were presented to them. So overall, pretty middle of the road Stephen King book for me. And similar to some of the other works that he has had, there were some Dark Tower connections in there, which are always things that I am extremely sort of hyper cognizant of at this point in time. As I am sort of finishing Stephen King's catalog of books, I'm constantly looking for books that can sort of be grouped in with some different elements of the Dark Tower universe. And Cell had a couple that were definitely there. This Clayton guy, this main character who's a comic book artist, one of the comic books that he writes is a Western fantasy comic called The Dark Wanderer. So Dark Tower, Dark Wanderer. There's immediately a connection there. The main character in this comic book, The Dark Wanderer, that Clayton has written, is a cowboy by the name of Ray Damon, who is experiencing the apocalypse of cowboys. Sounds very familiar, right? Ray Damon's initials are the same as Roland Deschain's. He is a cowboy. He uses a six-shooter, just like Roland Deschain. So there's some sort of reflection, to some extent, an almost alternate comic book version of the Dark Tower that exists in this part of the Stephen King multiverse. And in addition to that, in the Northern Counties Expo, Clayton and his other sort of allies in this fight against the phoners find a children's ride called Charlie the Choo Choo. And Charlie the Choo Choo is a children's book that Jake Chambers in the Dark Tower buys in the third book of the Dark Tower, The Wasteland. Charlie the Choo Choo is a representation of Blaine the Mono, one of the main antagonists in the Dark Tower universe. So there are some very clear connections here. There is a presence of Dark Tower universe elements in Cell, which were, again, always fun to look for, always fun to sort of recognize those Dark Tower Easter eggs in Stephen King books, and definitely fun that he was still doing so in 2006. So those are my likes, my dislikes, the Dark Tower universe elements, connections that I found in Cell by Stephen King. If you have read this book, I'd love to hear what you thought of it. Did your thoughts, your reactions, your feelings align with my own? Did you absolutely love this book? Did you hate this book? I am somewhere, again, sort of middle of the road, like a 6.5 to a 7 out of 10 type of vibe for me. And I'd be interested to hear from those who rank this way higher, this book is sort of among your favorite Stephen King books. I'd love to hear from those and from everyone in general. So thanks again for listening to me ramble on about another Stephen King book. Cell, another one down. I'm currently in the midst of reading Dreamcatcher, so that will likely be the next one that I talk about, and I am liking it so far. So yeah, we will catch up soon. Peace.